Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. Nepal Conversations is a podcast series where we talk to scholars and researchers about the interesting work on various aspects of Nepali society. This third series of Nepal Conversations will focus on unpacking the status of social science research and teaching in Nepal.
For this episode of Nepal Conversations, we are really excited to welcome Dr. Hemant Oza, who is the Principal Advisor of the Institute for Studies and Development Worldwide in Sydney and an Associate Professor at University of Canberra, Australia. He is the co-founder and former chair of ForestAction Nepal and a founder of Southasia Institute of Advanced Studies. Dr. Oja's research, development action, and policy engagement work cover issues of forest governance, climate change, water security, and food security. He has worked in Nepal, Afghanistan, India, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Cameroon, UK, and Australia.
Welcome to Nepal Conversations, Hemantji, and thank you so much for joining us today. You've been working as principal advisor of Institute of Studies and Development Worldwide. Could you tell us a bit about yourself, your academic journey, and your current research projects or priorities?
Thank you, Umaji, for inviting me to this interesting series of Nepal conversation. The kind of approach that I have taken in my research academic work is to confront everyday challenges of environmental governance, community development, community livelihoods. As we all know, Nepal is one of the least developed countries in formal Western sense, at least, and also a mountainous Himalayan, geography posing a lot of challenges. We have seen a lot of environmental problems, which are interconnected with problem of governance. So all of these have been actually, a key context, for my research and academic work. And I have always tried to, confront those practically, intellectually, and that actually led me to take certain kind of intellectual framings, conceptual framings like action research, critical action research, politics of knowledge, and then figuring out how, as a locally engaged researcher, I can make some contributions to understanding problems in some ways, in some new ways, and then also developing a community of practice around new ways of looking at old problems, reimagining, new approaches to learning, action, policy development, and overall social change. All of those, of course, within different sub-disciplines of environment, such as forestry, agriculture, natural resources, and more recently in the water sector as well.
Thank you, Hemantji. That's really interesting to hear about your really interdisciplinary and inspiring academic journey. And one thing we were really interested about your work is that you, for a long time, you worked as sort of the interdisciplinary researcher working at the interface between research and what policy and what you also said community of practice. We just wanted to hear a little bit about your experience of and also challenges in working at the intersection of research, policy, and practice in the context of Nepal. If you could shed light into that, that would be great.
Thank you, Nimeshji. That's a very interesting question. As we all know, coming from Nepal, the research environment in Nepal is not that encouraging in terms of all different aspects like resources, institutions, general political economy of recognition, and those sort of things. So it has always been a bit of a struggle for anyone trying to do this kind of two dimensional, if you like, kind of approach. Trying to engage theoretically, conceptually, and at the same time practically as well, both locally and also at national, subnational policies. That's the practice side. To give you the concrete, example of how I tackled, various challenges. In 2000, I co-founded together with a couple of other colleagues a research institute, which was primarily an NGO, legally. Um, it's called ForestAction Nepal. Our idea was to create our own space for doing critical and action-oriented research, because that time we didn't find any other institutions that has that vision, capability, and institutional space to do the kind of thing we wanted to do. Universities, they were quite academic in that sense, not really engaged with practical issues, and not being able to connect practice with theory. So universities severely limited. Several NGOs were there, some taking human right approach, advocacy kind of approach, as if they have known everything and nothing to explore and understand. So that is also not the kind of approach we wanted to take. We had to create our own niche institutional platform. For that, we set up one journal, Journal of Forest and Livelihood. We designed our own methods of doing research, platforms for communicating research, modalities of engaging with different kind of stakeholders. So we had to do all those things in the kind of environment that lacked those kind of conducive, platforms and institutions. Now, when you really try to do this kind of critical research, nobody really loves to hear critics of their assumptions, mental models, theories, uh, and knowledge, of course. So it takes a bit of time and perseverance, to be able to penetrate into those very repressive, discouraging systems, regimes of knowledge and power. And we are working in the context of primarily at that time, working mainly in the forestry sector, which is heavily top-down system of governance. The government owns the forest land, and government has its own bureaucracy and apparatus, including paramilitary, forces as well, to protect trees, forest, and animals, and forest land. And we were talking about democratizing that system, engaging communities, their knowledge, recognizing community rights, those sort of things, and that was quite radical. And the moment you start, doing that kind of research into those kind of territories, highly politicized and at the same time repressive, territories of governance, then you run the risk of losing your own, space for doing research. So we had to be a little tactical in some ways, and then trying to, recruit, engage, invite some progressive element within the government bureaucracy. And gradually what we saw within that forest sector is a number of educated people doing PhD from Western universities. They went back to Nepal, and they were a little, and quite open, to listen to new ideas. So they became actually our allies, and gradually we developed a strong community of practice, engaging those positive minded officials within the government as well, and gradually created those kind of what we call that time is cross institutional alliances, going beyond the boxes of institutions, government versus civil society. That was the kind of division created previously, and we wanted to dissect that division and go beyond those and unpack both sides and bring people who can have conversation, joint conversation, together from across different institutions. Maybe the other important challenge we confronted was to sustain our own work in terms of funding and resources, and for that we developed our partnership with several research institutions outside of Nepal, working in the environmental sector, and also universities in the UK, in the US, in other parts of Europe, and gradually Australia as well. So that sort of partnership with international institutions was very helpful, not only in generating some resource, but also in leveraging our knowledge products, building credibility, and building some international sort of influence as well, if you like. So that was also very important. And luckily, we were also able to compete global research funding, and we were able to generate, sometimes with partnership with other universities, sometimes ourselves alone. Linked to all of these was the question of building capacity around a new way of doing research practice, academics, development, and engagement, what I call now a sort of hybrid intellectuals, not just expert on particular discipline, but actually cross-disciplinary expertise, and putting all disciplines on one side. I think we also need that practice orientation, and practice is always cross-disciplinary, actually transdisciplinary. So not only interdisciplinary, but also cross and transdisciplinary, in the sense that hybrid intellectualism is able to recognize the knowledge that emerges in everyday practice and praxis and struggles, and someone as a researcher becomes able to articulate and theorize that sort of praxis as well into the wider academic debate.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your experience of leading research institutions, especially this kind of university spaces, and as you say, creating these cross institutional alliances. Do you see that the situation has changed or improved over a period of time now? Do you see more opportunities for research institutions now compared to when you started?
That's interesting. Certainly, change has happened, but what I find is that change has happened in both directions, some good and some not so good. I think the good changes that I see are, people, especially young and emerging researchers, uh, they are trained better these days, both within Nepal and outside, and they now have that capability to articulate practice and theory and policy, in better ways, I think, than in the past. But then the problem is still that sort of West centric, discipline bound knowledge production and training continues. Few years back, I met one guy who did some PhD in geography from the US. He came to see me in Nepal when I was there, and he was looking for some jobs. And when I had some conversation with him, the kind of expertise he got around GIS, remote sensing, and all those kind of technical modeling work, which requires a lot of secondary data, data infrastructure. Uh, that sort of expertise did not put that person very well into the Nepalese job market. Because unlike US and many developed countries, Nepal doesn't have those kind of secondary data, available for modeling and all those sort of things. You have to start everything from scratch almost. These days, of course, that data infrastructure is improving a little bit, but not to a level where you can readily apply that kind of GIS and modeling expertise and sell yourself in the job market. So my point here is that still that sort of Western training curriculum and skills that people get out of those don't put people in good place in Nepal. So there is a lack of an education and training system that really builds people's skills and expertise from the context, that fits well with the context. So a lot of those kind of trained people, they are unable to penetrate the messy, complex, context of job and work and research and engagement in Nepal. And I don't think any university in the world have recognized adequately. Of course, everyone now talks about context and we got to link practice and impact and all those. But I don't think the actual pedagogic practice of any Western universities prepares a Nepalese researcher to be competent in that context. So what sort of skills needed in Nepal is kind of activist, a blend of activism, entrepreneurship, leadership, and of course the relevant disciplinary technical skills, right? And that is truly transdisciplinary, and that cannot be trained outside of the context. Again, someone can have all those things in Harvard University and teach everything within Harvard complex, and then put the student into Nepalese context. That won't work. So that has to be learned from the practice, through praxis. That's why I call that praxis epistemology and critical action learning and research is really, really important. So going back to your question of change, yes, some change happened positively, but not so good changes include the political party based bounding and factionalization of intellectual practice. Everyone, as you know, uh, asks which political party are you affiliated with. That becomes a question of basic introduction between two Nepalese. Of course, that is good for state building and political engagement and participation. The problem that this kind of political party based bounding of intellectual practice is that everyone has to obey the leaders. They have to follow the leaders rather than critique the policies of parties and leaders. So that sort of freedom, intellectual practice free from those kind of political bounding, I think that is a major problem these days. So you have all intellectuals and their associations affiliated with different political parties, but very little independent academic and research, kind of work. So that is what most I find most worrying actually in Nepal these days.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hemantji. Following up on this idea of knowledge, politics, knowledge production, and the intellectual practice, we also had an opportunity to read one of your papers, Counteracting Hegemonic Powers in Policy Processes, which was published in Critical Policy Studies. And here you seem to highlight the role of critical action research in challenging and countering what you say hegemonic knowledge. Could you elaborate a bit on this, and what do you mean by countering hegemonic knowledge, and what is your approach to critical action research, especially in the context of Nepal?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very important question, and good that you read that paper as well, which I wrote in 2013. Look, first let me highlight what sort of hegemonic knowledge is in operation in areas that I have been working. Forestry, natural resource, climate change, for example, or water as well. First is the techno bureaucratic knowledge that is formally legitimized within the state system. You have forest service, you have engineering service, you have all different kind of agricultural service, and then you have people recruited as authentic holders of knowledge and scientists within the state system, given titles of, okay, senior scientist, senior forester, senior engineer, or whatever. So that whole system of technical knowledge being bureaucratized within the system of a state leads to a situation where you have only one formally coded form of knowledge is valid, accepted, and official. We have a history of almost 200 years, right from the unification formation of the state of Nepal, over 200 years. And we have that system developed and institutionalized. And that does not accept other forms of knowledges, community knowledge, indigenous knowledge, women's knowledge, um, and all other kind of practice-based, insights. So that is the form of hegemonic knowledge one has to confront if democratization has to happen in that regime. For example, forest governance, water governance, or climate. So that is one form of hegemonic knowledge. And another form of hegemonic knowledge in Nepal, in the context of international development, covering every sector almost, is this Western developmental knowledge that is brought by donors, international development actors. They have their own systems, and they use that system to advise Nepalese society and the government. For example, the logical framework, theory of change, monitoring and evaluation, project planning, project metrics, whatever, and all those sort of things. And now these things have gone all the way up to social inclusion. Of course, inclusion was also Nepalese society's own agenda for political change, but it has been objectified and captured by the development industry as well. And now you have got JETC or JETC, as a very short, acronym. And all of these knowledge converted into the tools. They are attached to funding and programming and resources and all sort of things, and they incentivize people to follow their knowledge systems, uh, and that actually disempowers and suppresses the original indigenous diverse ways of knowing and engagement. So that is another hegemonic knowledge. And the other aspect of the problem of knowledge hegemony uh, is 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 that there are some people who romanticizes and amplifies the value and legitimacy of community knowledge or even indigenous knowledge, for example. But I think there is also problem with community knowledge, and increasingly that is visible in the context of climate change, for example, because that knowledge may have been working when the threshold of climate anomaly was within the limit. But when ecological thresholds are reached, are surpassed, then that existing knowledge practice may not work. So that is where the role of critical action intellectuals come. Critical action intellectuals work both ways, challenging the hegemonic knowledge and also critiquing primary experience of that practical knowledge as well. Somebody has called, critic of epistemological critic of primary knowledge as well, experiential knowledge as well. I think I subscribe to that philosophy, um, and envision uh, a role for critical action research, which not only brings critical evidence but also engages in dialogue. And the dialogue that critical action researchers do with the holders of dominant knowledge, hegemonic knowledge, is critical, it's challenging. And then the dialogue they do with disadvantaged, marginalized groups is empowering. So both empowering dialogue on one side and then challenging dialogue on the other side, and then trying to create those more empowering, open, genuine, deliberative space where you foster this sort of dialectical clashes between all different kind of epistemologies, and then bring out new imaginations, new truth. We have proverb in Sanskrit that bade bade jayat tattvabodha. That is the crux of deliberation. We need to recognize those multiple epistemologies which have their own histories, own actors, careers, and critical action intellectuals should recognize those, analyze those, critique those, and then create a space for more empowering deliberation, through which new imagination of governance and practice, can be done.
Hemantji, I think that's really is an interesting segue for our next question, which kind of builds on the idea of critical action research. You mentioned this idea that there's sort of hegemonic knowledge, but at the same time, there is also a risk of romanticizing and legitimizing local knowledge. And that brings us to the another piece that we read of yours called "The Deliberative Scientist: Integrating Science and Politics in Forest Resource Governance in Nepal," which you co-authored with Naya Paudel, Maniraj Banjare, Cynthia McDougall, and John Cameron. And this book chapter actually came out in the edited book "Beyond the Biophysical Knowledge, Culture and Power in Agriculture and Natural Resource Management," edited by Laura German, Joshua Ramesh, Ritu Verma. I think it came out in 2010. And one of the things beyond looking at the relationship between local and scientific knowledge, which you mentioned in the as part of the previous response, the article also highlights the role of deliberation, which you started talking about a little bit. In what you in the article mentions, liberating scientific analysis from the techno-bureaucratic envelope for use within larger political goals of local communities. So that is basically your words that I'm quoting. Why is it necessary to liberate scientific knowledge from techno-bureaucratic envelope? What do you mean by this? And particularly in the context of contemporary Nepal, social scientists seen in Nepal, what might be its implication for social scientific research in Nepal?
Thanks for referring to that paper. I can start with an example. In forestry, to measure timber volume, round timber volume, there is one formula called water worth. Okay, This formula assumes that about 20-25% of uh, the volume of a round timber, or tree, will be lost when you extract timber from the tree. But it depends on different types of trees, and a lot of time when this formula is used to calculate the volume of timber in a community forest, community groups are not happy with that amount of wastage being accommodated into the calculation. And there have been other attempts by researchers uh, to take that issue into account and revise the formula to make it more precise, to make it more realistic, right? But then the official rule of the government, I think it hasn't changed yet. But until I was active some years back in Nepal in those issues, that formula prevailed. So this is an example of how a particular formula, or for that matter, a particular form of knowledge, technical knowledge, is objectified as a rule, as authentic and as the only rule to be. So this is a situation of science being hijacked by the techno-bureaucratic system, right? I'm not against science, and I'm not against some form of governing, some form of rules and governance that are necessary, to organize our resource management system, public life, and all those. So in that sense, I'm not totally postmodernist or post-structuralist. Okay, so I'm still in the modernist domain, maybe critical modernist in that sense. My view is to not to reject science, not to replace that kind of formula, not to reject any kind of formula, but to update, improvise those kind of formulas or tools, or whatever, and then also make them contextual. I can give you another example. When I was myself working as a forester, and working with a community that had an elder plantation at full stage, uh, and our forestry knowledge, based on our forestry knowledge, I advised the community group who was managing the forest to cut, uh, a number of trees from the forest, so that they can have few trees on the forest which can grow better timber in a few years. So that was my advice, based on the forestry science that I had learned. But then what communities told me in response was, they don't care the quality of timber. What they care is sustained flow and production of firewood every year. Whatever the size of the tree, whatever the quality of the tree, that doesn't matter. So they wanted that sort of subsistence, sustained, uninterrupted flow of fuel wood in the form of small twigs and small timber, whatever the quality it is. So this is again another example of how this state legitimized version of science is creating problems in every domain. So we need to have a system whereby the state doesn't deliver science. State is actually an enabler of robust knowledge systems, of good knowledge systems that can be produced anywhere. You don't have to produce knowledge yourself to be legitimate. You can have a system of peer review, you can have a system of quality control, You can work on all those kind of things, as a state, as an state institution. But at the moment, at least in several environmental sector, what I have seen is the state has its own system of producing knowledge, which is defunct, useless, and it does not accept better knowledge produced outside of its system. So that is why I have argued for rescuing knowledge production system from the current capture by the state. Two additional point I wanted to make here. One is, not just bringing Western science to Nepal, even critical social science, even anthropological, research is problematic. Because that Western anthropological orientation that people take when they go into research in Nepal, they just observe phenomenon, they just analyze things from their scholastic academic interest, and there is no giving back, there is no real engagement, there is no partnership, there is no democratic engagement between the Western researchers and the local participants. So there is a need for transformation in that kind of partnership as well. In my own work, I come across this kind of Western researchers, and I have functioning partnership with several of them, and we have very critical conversation around this, and a lot of time we make some kind of pragmatic, practical understanding about having multiple objectives. Okay, academic knowledge objectives from this particular research, that's fine. Okay, 1, 2, 3. And then community impact related objectives. Okay, 1, 2, 3. We will organize some knowledge forums, and I have actually worked on that front as policy lab, policy forums, those sort of things. So we will have some outcomes for communities, and we also generally include some outcomes for national policy discourse as well, right? So that way we try to democratize those research partnerships between Nepalese and Western research groups. I think that is also important, going forward in all sectors and disciplines. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for highlighting the importance of this being critical and questioning what is knowledge, and also being mindful of how knowledge is being produced. We have now come to the end of our conversation. So finally, we would like to go back to the topic that you've just mentioned about the research partnership, and especially given your diverse experience of working both in global south and global north. Where do you see Nepal's social science research environment in terms of the future opportunities and challenges, and maybe also you could share your thoughts on this north-south research partnership, and how there might be possibility to reimagine it, especially in the context of what you were just mentioning about democratizing and decolonizing knowledge in the context of Nepal.
Yeah, thank you, Uma. Important question again. First of all, in Nepal, the social sciences are also highly divided and opaque to one another in terms of disciplines. You may have heard the story of the division of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, for example, right? Um, Earlier it was same department, and recently it was divided. There was breakaway. I would have anticipated that the different traditional disciplines will actually come closer in terms of interactions and interconnectedness rather than taking more kind of fragmentation approach. So there is a problem within the disciplinary knowledge communities in Nepal, especially within the universities. So, and the solution is to come out of those boundaries and have conversations between disciplines and, let's say, disciplines, at least, within the academic sector, within the universities. And then secondly, a lot of interesting interdisciplinary policy engaged research is being done by NGOs. There are 10, 12 NGOs in Nepal, which are doing really, really interesting work. But then the problem with them is there is no connection with higher level theorizing and conceptualizing. And second problem is a lot of this work is again sponsored, supported, and framed by Western science, Western frames of knowledge. Okay. Some NGOs in different situations have been able to negotiate that pressure coming from outside. As I mentioned, we tried a little bit in the case of ForestAction, and also in the case of another institute that I co-founded together with a couple of others in Southasia Institute of Advanced Studies. So that sort of negotiation is happening, but not to the ideal stage. So that is another area of improvement for the social science work in Nepal. That research being delivered by non-university research groups to be more, theorized, to be connected to the theoretical level as well, because they are doing very well at practical discourse and policy discourse level, but not enough theorizing is happening. So there is actually a complementary interface between those university departments of social sciences and the non-university research institutes. So if we can envision some kind of meta institutional platforms that brings all this together, at least in the form of conversations, interactions, and collaboration, that would be great. I heard that some sort of state sponsored social science research council or something like that is in the process of development, but I don't know what has happened to that. And of course, state funding and state support to critical research, critical social science research is vital, is extremely important. You cannot just rely on international funding, because international funding is increasingly tied to their own funders, strategic objectives, even academic research. We know that. So Nepal needs to recognize the value of social science research, and then create a mechanism for supporting financially. And for NGOs research work, there is a need for separate regulatory system within the Social Welfare Council that regulates all NGOs doing all kind of work. I think research NGOs needs a separate mechanism that provides them freedom and enabling environment to undertake critical research. And finally, Nepal needs to have, I don't know if it has a comprehensive innovation policy. Every country, developed country, they have that. And research and development spending is justified, based on country's innovation policy. So Nepal needs to have that policy and recognize creative critical, policy-oriented, pragmatic, all versions of social science, interdisciplinary social science, I would say, be supported, by the government. Because at the end of the day, even if a critical social science research project is critical of a particular government policy or a minister's decision, it is in the interest of the country, to bring that critical knowledge and change and contribute to change. So government and the state as a whole should be supportive of overall social science work in Nepal.
Thank you so much, Hemant. That was really interesting, and thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hemant ji.